21 years ago, Michael Thompson, a promising 24-year-old law student, vanished without a trace after leaving the University of Pennsylvania library on a cold October evening in 2003. The disappearance plunged his family into an abyss of grief and desperation, while the Philadelphia community was left grappling with unanswered questions. Police investigated multiple theories, from random crime to voluntary disappearance, but the case grew cold, leaving behind only heartbreak and frustration. Michael's parents, David and Margaret Thompson, refused to give up hope, spending their life savings on private investigators and never stopping their fight for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The Biddle Law Library stood like a fortress of knowledge against the autumn sky that Tuesday evening. Security cameras captured Michael Thompson's final moments as a free man, his tall frame moving confidently through the Gothic corridors, law books tucked under his arm, completely unaware that he was walking toward an encounter that would erase him from existence. Michael wasn't just any student. He was the pride of South Philadelphia, the son of a postal worker and a school secretary who had sacrificed everything to give their boy a chance at something bigger. At 24, he carried the hopes of 3 generations of blue-collar Thompsons on his shoulders. His professors described him as brilliant but humble, the kind of student who stayed after class to help struggling classmates understand constitutional law. That October night, the library's fluorescent lights cast long shadows as Michael gathered his materials. Fellow students would later remember him seeming unusually focused, almost urgent. He'd been working on something, a research project that had consumed his attention for weeks. But what exactly he was investigating would remain a mystery that would haunt investigators for 2 decades. The security footage shows him leaving through the main entrance at 9:47 p.m. He walked toward Locust Street, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. By 9:52 p.m., he had vanished completely, as if Philadelphia had simply swallowed him whole. His car remained in the student parking lot, keys still in his backpack untouched. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, his bed unslept in, his coffee maker programmed for a morning that would never come. The silence that followed would prove more devastating than any scream. The Thompson family's world collapsed in slow motion. Margaret Thompson, a woman whose faith had sustained her through decades of financial struggle, found herself bargaining with God in empty churches, lighting candles until her fingers were raw with wax burns. David Thompson, a man who had never missed a day of work in 30 years, began calling in sick to spend his days walking Philadelphia's streets, showing Michael's photo to anyone who would look. The initial police response was textbook. Search parties combed Fairmount Park, divers explored the Schuylkill River, and detectives interviewed everyone in Michael's orbit. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran investigator with the Philadelphia Police Department, led the case with the methodical precision that had solved dozens of missing persons cases before. But Michael Thompson would prove different. Every lead felt promising for about 24 hours, Martinez would later reflect. Then it would dissolve like smoke. I've never seen anything like it. It was as if someone had professionally erased a human being. The theories multiplied like cancer cells. Michael had gambling debts. Michael was involved with drugs. Michael had a secret girlfriend. Michael had run away to start a new life. Each possibility was investigated and discarded, leaving the family to endure the whispered speculation of neighbors who meant well but understood nothing about the particular torture of loving someone who has simply vanished. By Christmas 2003, the missing person flyers that had papered every corner of University City were fading and peeling, replaced by holiday decorations that felt obscene in their cheerfulness. The Thompsons couldn't bring themselves to take down Michael's Christmas stocking, couldn't pack away the gifts they had bought him, couldn't accept that their son had become a ghost. Margaret began keeping a journal, writing letters to Michael as if he might somehow receive them. Day 73, she wrote, your father walked past Penn today and saw students who look like you from behind. He follows them sometimes, just to be sure. I don't tell him I do the same thing at the grocery store, at the bank, everywhere I go. We're becoming people we don't recognize, living a life we never wanted. The investigation slowly shifted from active to cold. Detective Martinez was reassigned to other cases. The search parties stopped meeting. The local news moved on to fresher tragedies. Michael Thompson joined the ranks of the disappeared, a photograph in a file, a case number in a database, a family's private hell disguised as statistics. But in the shadows of their grief, the Thompsons made a vow that would define the next 21 years of their lives. They would never stop looking for their son. By 2008, 5 years had passed since Michael Thompson walked into the Philadelphia night. The initial surge of community support had long since faded, replaced by the polite discomfort people show when confronted with unresolved tragedy. Friends stopped mentioning Michael's name around his parents, thinking silence was kindness. They were wrong. David Thompson had aged a decade in 5 years. His postal route took him past the university daily, and each trip became a ritual of pain. He would slow his truck near the law school, scanning faces, hoping against logic that Michael might simply reappear, explanation in hand, ready to resume the life that had been suspended in amber since October 2003. Margaret had transformed their home into an unofficial command center. Michael's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, but the rest of the house had become a shrine to detection. Wall charts tracked leads. Filing cabinets held copies of every police report, every witness statement, every dead-end investigation. She had taught herself to be a private investigator out of necessity, because hope required action, and action required evidence. The Philadelphia Police Department's file on Michael Thompson grew thicker, but no more illuminating. Detective Martinez, now promoted to sergeant, would occasionally revisit the case during slow periods, but the brutal mathematics of police work meant that active cases took priority over cold ones. Michael had become a name on a list, a reminder of the cases that got away. The hardest part wasn't the not knowing, Margaret would later say. It was watching the world forget. People would say, time heals all wounds, but they don't understand. Time doesn't heal. Time just makes you better at carrying the weight. The Thompsons spent their savings on private investigators, psychics, and reward money that went unclaimed. They attended support groups for families of missing persons, where they learned that their pain was both unique and universal. Every family had the same haunted look, the same desperate energy, the same stubborn refusal to accept what everyone else considered inevitable. By 2010, 7 years post-disappearance, even the most optimistic investigators privately assumed Michael Thompson was dead. But his parents had moved beyond hope into something more dangerous: absolute faith. They would find their son, alive or dead, or die trying. The university had moved on. New law students occupied the library where Michael had spent his final known hours. His name appeared occasionally in true crime forums and missing person databases, but Philadelphia had swallowed his story the same way it had swallowed him, completely and without explanation. What none of them knew was that the truth hadn't disappeared. It had simply been waiting, hidden in plain sight, for someone to look in the right place with the right eyes. And in a basement storage room filled with forgotten case files, that truth was growing more dangerous by the day. The silence was about to break. In March 2024, 21 years after Michael Thompson vanished, a routine renovation of the Philadelphia Police Department's evidence storage facility would accidentally crack open a case that had been sealed in silence for 2 decades. What maintenance worker Carlos Rivera found in a mislabeled box would prove that sometimes the most important evidence hides in the most ordinary places. The basement of the PPD's 18th District had become a graveyard of forgotten investigations. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling contained the remnants of solved cases, cold cases, and cases that fell somewhere in between. Budget cuts meant that proper archival was a luxury the department couldn't afford, so evidence often got stored wherever space could be found, labeled by overworked clerks who sometimes made crucial mistakes. Carlos Rivera had been cleaning out storage rooms for 30 years, and he'd learned not to look too closely at what he was moving. But something about the box labeled Thompson, Domestic Dispute 2003, caught his attention. Michael Thompson's case had been classified as a missing person, not a domestic dispute. Rivera's curiosity, combined with his meticulous nature, led him to open the box that had been sitting untouched for over 2 decades. Inside, among water-damaged files and faded photographs, Rivera found something that should have changed everything in 2003. 3 spiral notebooks, filled with Michael Thompson's handwriting. The notebooks contained detailed notes about something called the Circle, a network of individuals connected to the university that Michael had been investigating in the weeks before his disappearance. The notebooks read like the journal of someone who had stumbled onto something far bigger and more dangerous than he could handle. Michael's neat handwriting documented meetings in shadows, conversations that stopped when he approached, and a pattern of behavior among certain faculty members and administrators that had alarmed him deeply. "They think I don't notice," Michael had written in his final entry, dated October 14, 2003, just one day before he vanished. "But I've been watching, documenting, collecting proof. What they're doing to these students. Someone has to stop it. Tomorrow I'm going to Professor Hartwell with everything I have. He'll know what to do." Rivera immediately contacted Detective Martinez, now a lieutenant nearing retirement. When she saw the notebooks, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's dampness. These weren't the writings of a confused young man or someone planning to disappear. These were the meticulous notes of an amateur investigator who had uncovered something that got him killed. The discovery raised a horrifying question. How had 3 notebooks containing potential evidence in a missing person case been misfiled and forgotten for 21 years? The answer would reveal a system failure so complete it bordered on criminal negligence. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had seen enough corruption in her 28 years with the Philadelphia Police Department to recognize a cover-up when she saw one. The mislabeled evidence box was no accident. It was deliberate concealment. But by whom and why? The notebooks revealed that Michael Thompson had been investigating what he called the Circle, a group of university faculty, administrators, and prominent Philadelphia figures who were allegedly involved in activities that Michael found deeply disturbing. His notes mentioned late-night meetings in professor offices, strange financial transactions, and young students who seemed to disappear from classes without explanation. Most chilling was Michael's description of Professor Edmund Hartwell, a respected member of the law faculty who had been Michael's academic advisor. According to the notebooks, Hartwell was not just a member of the Circle, he was its center. Michael had documented several instances where struggling students would meet privately with Hartwell, only to either drop out shortly after or exhibit dramatic personality changes. Sarah became a different person after her meeting with Professor H, Michael had written about a fellow student. She used to be outgoing, confident. Now she barely speaks in class, and when she does, she seems terrified. I tried to talk to her, but she looked at me like I was dangerous and walked away. Something happened in that office. Martinez began checking the current status of everyone mentioned in Michael's notebooks. What she found was a pattern of premature deaths, sudden disappearances, and lives derailed in ways that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. Of the 12 students Michael had been concerned about, 4 had died in apparent suicides within 5 years of their graduation, 3 had moved out of state and cut all contact with family, and 2 more had simply vanished without a trace. Professor Hartwell had retired in 2005, just 2 years after Michael's disappearance, citing health concerns. He had moved to a compound in rural Pennsylvania, where he lived as a recluse, but property records showed that the compound was owned by a trust that included several names Martinez recognized from Michael's notes. The most disturbing discovery came when Martinez cross-referenced the investigation files from Michael's case. Detective Robert Kane, who had been Martinez's partner in 2003, had been the one who initially processed the evidence from Michael's apartment and car. Kane had retired abruptly in 2004, citing stress-related health issues. He now lived in Florida under an assumed name, his pension records showing payments far larger than his rank should have entitled him to. Martinez realized that Michael Thompson hadn't just stumbled onto a conspiracy, he had been silenced by one. And the people responsible were still out there, living comfortable lives built on the foundation of a young man's murder. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps Michael Thompson's story reach more people. On November 15, 2024, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez knocked on the door of a modest house in Clearwater, Florida. The man who answered was a shadow of the detective Robert Kane she had once called partner. 20 years of guilt had carved deep lines into his face, and his hands shook as he recognized her through the screen door. "I've been waiting for this day," Kane said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of nearby traffic. "I knew someone would eventually find those notebooks." What Kane told Martinez over the next 4 hours would finally explain Michael Thompson's disappearance and reveal a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Philadelphia's academic and political establishment. The Circle was real, and it was far worse than Michael had imagined. Kane explained that the Circle operated as a sophisticated criminal organization disguised as an academic society. Professor Hartwell recruited vulnerable students, those with financial problems, family issues, or academic struggles, and offered them special mentorship programs. What followed was systematic exploitation that included financial fraud, identity theft, and worse crimes that Kane couldn't bring himself to name directly. They had protection at every level, Kane revealed. Police, judges, city officials. When Michael started asking questions, Hartwell panicked. He called in favors. The order came down from above. The Thompson case was to be mishandled from the beginning. Kane admitted that he had deliberately misfiled evidence, ignored witnesses, and steered the investigation away from the university. He had been paid $50,000 to ensure that Michael Thompson's case would go cold. He thought Michael had simply been scared off, maybe paid to leave town. He claimed he never knew Michael was dead until years later. Hartwell told us the kid was just being dramatic, that they'd straightened him out, Kane said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I thought Michael had taken money to forget what he saw and started over somewhere else. I didn't know they killed him, I swear I didn't know. But Kane's confession came with a price. He would only provide testimony in exchange for immunity. He had kept insurance over the years, documents, recordings, and photographs that proved the Circle's activities and the subsequent cover-up. The evidence he possessed could bring down not just Hartwell, but a network of corruption that had operated with impunity for decades. Martinez found herself facing a terrible choice. She could pursue justice for Michael Thompson by making a deal with the man who had helped cover up his murder. Or she could let Kane face the consequences of his corruption and risk losing the only key to unraveling 21 years of lies. As she drove back to Philadelphia with Kane's evidence locked in the trunk of her car, Martinez thought about David and Margaret Thompson, now in their 70s, who had never stopped believing their son's story would eventually be told. They deserved the truth, even if it came wrapped in the devil's bargain. The silence that had protected the Circle for 21 years was finally beginning to crack. Armed with Robert Kane's evidence and testimony, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez assembled a task force that would become the largest corruption investigation in Philadelphia's modern history. The joint operation between the Philadelphia Police Department, the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office included 47 investigators, forensic specialists, and federal prosecutors. What they uncovered in the winter of 2024 was a criminal enterprise that had operated under the protection of academic prestige for over 3 decades. The truth about Michael Thompson's final hours began to emerge through a combination of Kane's confessions, advanced digital forensics, and testimony from survivors who had finally found the courage to speak after decades of silence. The picture that emerged was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Michael hadn't simply stumbled onto a conspiracy. He had methodically documented a sophisticated criminal organization that had been preying on vulnerable students since the 1970s. On October 15, 2003, Michael had indeed gone to Professor Edmund Hartwell's office with his notebooks, believing he was bringing evidence to someone who would help him expose the Circle's crimes. Security footage from 2003, previously declared corrupted and unusable by the original investigation, was recovered through advanced digital restoration techniques that hadn't existed 21 years earlier. The FBI's cyber division worked for 3 months to piece together fragments of data that had been deliberately damaged, but not completely destroyed. The grainy, restored images told a story that chilled everyone who watched them. Michael was shown entering Hartwell's office building at 10:23 p.m., carrying his backpack and a manila folder containing what investigators now knew were copies of financial records, student transcripts that had been illegally altered, and photographs of late-night meetings between faculty and students. The timestamp showed him walking confidently down the hallway, his shoulders straight with the conviction of someone who believed he was about to save lives. He never came out alive. Dr. Patricia Wells, now a respected professor at Georgetown University, had spent 21 years in therapy dealing with the trauma of what she had witnessed that night. After decades of panic attacks, survivors' guilt, and 2 serious suicide attempts, she finally agreed to testify about the events that had haunted her dreams for over 2 decades. I was working late in the graduate library when I heard voices coming from Professor Hartwell's office around 10:30. Wells testified before the grand jury, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, it sounded like a normal academic discussion, but then Michael's voice got louder, more insistent. He was saying things like, "These students trusted you," and "I won't let you destroy any more lives." Wells described hearing Hartwell's voice, along with at least two other men, trying to calm Michael down, offering him research positions, graduate fellowships, anything to make him reconsider his course of action. But Michael's response, captured on her testimony, would become the defining moment of the case. "You can't buy my silence. These students deserve justice, and they're going to get it." That's when the tone changed completely, Wells continued, tears streaming down her face. "I heard what sounded like furniture being moved violently, something heavy falling, and Michael's voice just stopped. Then there was this terrible silence that seemed to last forever. What Wells witnessed next would haunt her forever. Around midnight, she saw Hartwell and two other men she recognized as Dr. James Morrison and Dr. Richard Klein, both university trustees, carrying what appeared to be a large Persian rug from the office to a service elevator. The rug was heavy enough that it took all three men to manage it, and one end was stained with what looked like dark liquid in the dim hallway lighting. "I knew something terrible had happened, but I was so scared," Wells admitted. The circle had ways of making problems disappear. Students who asked too many questions would suddenly lose their financial aid, their grades would mysteriously drop, or they'd face academic discipline for violations they didn't commit. "I was a single mother working 3 jobs to put myself through graduate school. I couldn't risk losing everything, so I told myself maybe Michael had just been hurt. Maybe they were taking him to a hospital." But Wells's conscience wouldn't let her rest. 3 days after Michael's disappearance, she anonymously called the police tip line and tried to report what she had seen. The call was taken by Detective Robert Kane, who assured her that the information would be investigated. Instead, Kane buried the tip and never followed up, a betrayal that Wells wouldn't learn about until 21 years later. The investigation revealed that Hartwell's office had been hastily renovated during winter break 2003, with new carpeting, furniture, and wall paneling installed. Construction records, subpoenaed through federal court orders, showed that several bags of concrete mix, industrial-grade cleaning supplies, and professional carpet installation equipment had been delivered to the building during the renovation period, far more materials than needed for the reported cosmetic updates. The renovation had been paid for through a discretionary academic improvement fund controlled by the Circle's members, and the work had been performed by a construction company owned by the brother of Dr. Morrison. No permits had been filed, no inspections conducted, and no photographs taken of the completed work, highly unusual for a university that typically documented every maintenance activity for insurance and liability purposes. Ground-penetrating radar scans of the university's basement levels, conducted by the FBI's evidence response team, revealed a concrete anomaly beneath the foundation of Hartwell's former office building. The radar showed a rectangular void approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, located directly below where Michael had last been seen alive. On December 3, 2024, excavation crews working under heavy police security began the grim task of breaking through layers of concrete and steel reinforcement. The work took 3 days, with investigators carefully documenting every layer of material removed. What they found at the bottom of that concrete tomb was the answer to 21 years of questions and the beginning of Margaret Thompson's final journey toward peace. Michael Thompson's remains were found wrapped in the Persian rug that Dr. Wells had seen being carried from Hartwell's office. Even after more than 2 decades, forensic experts were able to determine that he had died from multiple blunt force trauma injuries to the head, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. His notebooks were found with him, their pages stained but still legible, providing a written record of his investigation right up until his final day. The coroner's report confirmed what the family had feared, but never stopped hoping against. Michael had died on the night he disappeared, October 15, 2003, sometime between 10:30 p.m. and midnight. He had been murdered for trying to protect other students from the predators who were supposed to educate and guide them. As news of the discovery spread through Philadelphia, the city grappled with the realization that one of its most respected educational institutions had been the site of a murder that was then covered up for over 2 decades. The University of Pennsylvania's Board of Trustees called an emergency meeting. The mayor demanded a full investigation into police corruption, and families across the country began to wonder what other secrets might be buried beneath the ivy-covered walls of America's most prestigious universities. The arrests began at dawn on December 10, 2024, in a coordinated operation that spanned 3 states and involved over 100 federal agents. Professor Edmund Hartwell, now 78 years old and living in his fortified compound in rural Pennsylvania, was taken into custody without resistance as FBI agents surrounded his property. His only words to the arresting officers were, "I've been expecting you for 21 years. I suppose it's time to face what we've done." Hartwell's compound, purchased with money traced back to the Circle's criminal activities, contained a library of documents that prosecutors would later describe as a criminal archive spanning 5 decades. The former professor had kept meticulous records of every student exploited, every official bribed, and every crime committed in the name of maintaining the Circle's power and secrecy. It was as if he had been preparing for this day, ensuring that if he fell, he would take everyone down with him. The scope of the Circle's criminal enterprise shocked even seasoned investigators who had spent their careers dismantling organized crime syndicates. Over 32 years of operation, they had systematically exploited over 400 students through a sophisticated network of academic fraud, financial manipulation, sexual coercion, and psychological abuse. The organization operated with the precision of a corporation and the ruthlessness of a mafia family. The network's reach extended far beyond the university walls. Federal prosecutors unveiled indictments against 3 university trustees, 2 Philadelphia city councilmen, a federal judge, the former police captain who had overseen the district where Michael's case was initially investigated, and 17 other individuals including lawyers, accountants, and business leaders who had provided services to the Circle over the decades. Dr. James Morrison, one of the trustees arrested in the coordinated sweep, had maintained what prosecutors called the ledger, a detailed record of the Circle's activities that documented decades of exploitation with business-like efficiency. Morrison had kept the records as insurance against his co-conspirators, never imagining they would become evidence in his own prosecution for murder and racketeering. The ledger revealed that the Circle operated through a careful selection process that targeted students who were vulnerable but promising. They looked for young people from working-class families, first-generation college students, those struggling financially or dealing with personal crises. Once identified, these students were offered special mentorship programs, research opportunities, or academic support that gradually drew them into the Circle's web of control. What began as legitimate academic assistance would slowly transform into exploitation. Students would be asked to perform small favors, typing documents, attending social events, running personal errands for faculty members. The favors would gradually become more compromising, often involving the alteration of academic records, the theft of research materials, or participation in fraudulent schemes. Students who resisted faced academic sabotage, threats against their families, or worse. The most chilling discovery was a section of the ledger titled Permanent Solutions, a list of problems that had been resolved over the years through methods that ranged from character assassination to violence. Michael Thompson's name appeared on this list alongside 12 other students who had either died under suspicious circumstances or disappeared entirely between 1985 and 2010. Each name was followed by a clinical notation indicating the method used to silence them: academic dismissal and financial ruin, relocated to avoid further contact, automobile accident, closed case, apparent suicide, family satisfied with explanation, and in Michael's case, office incident, permanent disposal, case redirected through Asset K. Asset K was Robert Kane, whose cooperation with federal investigators revealed the full extent of police corruption that had protected the Circle for decades. Kane's testimony detailed how the Circle had cultivated relationships with law enforcement officials through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and mutual benefit arrangements. Police officers who cooperated received cash payments, favorable treatment in misconduct investigations, and assistance with personal legal problems. The corruption had been so thorough that when Michael's case was assigned to Kane in 2003, it came with explicit instructions from his captain to handle it quietly and let it go cold. Kane had been paid $50,000 to ensure that the investigation would be deliberately mishandled. evidence would be misfiled, and witnesses would be discouraged from coming forward. Margaret Thompson, now 74 years old and using a walker due to arthritis that had worsened during years of stress, sat in the front row of the federal courthouse as the charges were read. 21 years of grief had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the scope of evil that had stolen her son's life. As prosecutor Jessica Chen read the names of all the victims, Margaret wept, not just for Michael, but for all the young lives that had been destroyed by the greed and cruelty of people they had trusted. "I always knew Michael was trying to help someone," she told reporters outside the courthouse, her voice steady despite her tears. "But I never imagined how many people needed his help. He died because he couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt. That's the son we raised, and that's the son we lost. These people didn't just kill Michael. They killed every student he could have saved, every case he could have won, every family he could have helped." David Thompson, battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer and confined to a wheelchair, lived long enough to see Hartwell and 6 other defendants charged with first-degree murder, racketeering, conspiracy, and over 200 individual counts of fraud and exploitation. On the day the indictments were announced, David smiled for the first time since 2003, telling his wife, "Michael can rest now. Everyone knows he was a hero." David Thompson died peacefully 2 weeks after the arrests, finally able to rest, knowing that his son's killers would face justice. His final words, according to Margaret, were, "Tell Michael we never stopped believing in him." Former Detective Robert Kane's cooperation with federal prosecutors led to a plea deal that sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. His testimony was crucial in convicting the others, but many felt justice had been incomplete. The man who had helped cover up Michael's murder would likely outlive both parents who had never stopped searching for their son. As the trials proceeded through 2025, the University of Pennsylvania faced a federal investigation, congressional hearings, and civil lawsuits that would ultimately cost over $200 million in settlements to victims and their families. The law school's accreditation was suspended pending a complete review of its governance and oversight procedures. 3 buildings on campus were renamed, including the hall that now bears Michael Thompson's name. The trials themselves became a media sensation, with court TV providing gavel-to-gavel coverage and documentary crews from around the world descending on Philadelphia to cover what legal experts called the most significant academic corruption case in American history. The proceedings revealed not just the crimes committed against individual students, but the systematic failure of institutional oversight that had allowed the circle to operate with impunity for over 3 decades. On a grey February morning in 2025, under skies that seemed to weep with the assembled mourners, Michael Thompson was finally laid to rest in Laurel Hill Cemetery, where 4 generations of Thompsons had been buried before him. The funeral that should have happened in 2003 became something far more significant, a celebration of a life cut short, a testament to the power of love that refuses to surrender to evil, and a rallying cry for justice that echoed far beyond Philadelphia's city limits. The service drew over 800 people to the small Catholic church, where Michael had been baptized as an infant. His law school classmates, now successful attorneys and judges in their own right, served as pallbearers. They carried the weight of their friend's coffin and the heavier burden of knowing they had lived the lives he never could. Professor Sarah Martinez from Georgetown University, who had never met Michael but had followed his story, delivered a eulogy that captured the essence of a young man who had died trying to protect others. "Michael Thompson could have looked the other way," Martinez said, her voice carrying across the packed church. "He could have focused on his studies, graduated, and built a successful career without ever acknowledging the suffering he witnessed. But Michael understood something that takes some people a lifetime to learn. The law is not about abstract principles or legal precedents. The law is about protecting people who cannot protect themselves, and sometimes that protection comes at the ultimate cost." The crowd included dozens of survivors of the circle's exploitation, men and women now in their 40s and 50s who had finally found the courage to come forward and share their stories. Many wept openly as they listened to descriptions of Michael's investigation, realizing that his death had been an attempt to save them from the very abuse they had endured in silence for decades. Among the mourners was Dr. Patricia Wells, whose testimony had been crucial in securing convictions. She had flown in from Georgetown to pay her respects to the young man whose courage had finally freed her from 21 years of guilt and fear. "I should have been braver," she told Margaret Thompson after the service. "Michael was trying to save all of us, and I let fear keep me silent. I'll carry that regret forever." Margaret Thompson, frail but resolute in her grief, squeezed Dr. Wells's hand and replied, "Michael would have understood. He knew how powerful fear could be, how institutions could silence victims. That's why he kept such detailed notes. He knew someone might be too afraid to speak, so he tried to speak for everyone." The University of Pennsylvania, represented by its interim president, announced the creation of the Michael Thompson Center for Ethics and Justice, housed in the law school building where he had spent his final hours. The center would be funded by a $50 million endowment created from the assets seized from the Circle's members, ensuring that Michael's legacy would be one of protection rather than exploitation. Professor Edmund Hartwell was sentenced to life without parole, along with Dr. Morrison and Dr. Klein. The 78-year-old man who had once commanded respect in academic circles would spend his remaining years in the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption of power and the deadly consequences of unchecked privilege. During his sentencing hearing, Hartwell offered what prosecutors called a calculated apology, words that seemed designed more to influence appeals courts than to express genuine remorse. "I deeply regret that my actions led to the death of a promising young man," Hartwell said, reading from a prepared statement. "Michael Thompson was an exceptional student who deserved better from those entrusted with his education." Margaret Thompson, given the opportunity to address the court during victim impact statements, stood slowly and faced the man who had destroyed her family. Her words, spoken in a voice strengthened by 21 years of grief and determination, would be quoted in newspapers around the world. "Professor Hartwell, you speak of regret, but regret implies that you wish you had chosen differently. What you regret is getting caught. You regret that Michael's courage was stronger than your cruelty. You regret that love proved more powerful than fear. My son died because he believed in justice, and justice has finally found you. You took 21 years from our family, but you will spend whatever years you have left knowing that Michael Thompson's truth was stronger than your lies." The trials and convictions sent shockwaves through higher education institutions across the country. Universities implemented new oversight procedures, created anonymous reporting systems for students, and established independent ombudsman offices to investigate allegations of abuse. The Michael Thompson Protocols became standard practice at law schools nationwide, requiring faculty to undergo annual ethics training and creating clear boundaries for student-faculty interactions. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez retired 6 months after solving the case that had haunted her for over 2 decades. She kept Michael's notebooks in her home office, bound in leather and displayed in a place of honor, a reminder that persistence and integrity can triumph over corruption, even when justice takes 21 years to arrive. "Every detective has cases that stay with them," Martinez reflected during her retirement ceremony. "Michael Thompson was mine. I used to think I had failed him because I couldn't solve his case in 2003, but I've come to understand that some truths take time to emerge. Michael planted seeds of justice with his investigation, and even though he didn't live to see it, those seeds eventually grew into the tree that brought down his killers." The ripple effects of the Michael Thompson case extended far beyond Philadelphia. Federal legislation was introduced requiring universities to report suspected crimes to independent oversight bodies rather than handling investigations internally. The Campus Safety and Transparency Act, known informally as Michael's Law, passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support and was signed by the President in a ceremony attended by Margaret Thompson and the families of other victims. Margaret Thompson moved to a small apartment near Laurel Hill Cemetery, where she could visit Michael's grave every Sunday, bringing flowers and updates about the ongoing appeals and the positive changes being implemented in his memory. At 75, she had finally found a peace that had eluded her for over 2 decades, not because her son had returned, but because his story had been told truthfully and completely, and because his sacrifice was being honored through concrete changes that would protect future students. "Michael always said the law was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves," she reflected during her final interview with the documentary crew that had followed the case for 2 years. He died living up to that belief. For the longest time I thought his story was about loss, what we lost when he was taken from us. But now I understand it's about courage, about the power of one person to change everything, even at the cost of their own life. The Michael Thompson case officially closed with 17 convictions and sentences totaling over 400 years in federal prison, but it opened conversations about institutional accountability, the protection of whistleblowers, and the deadly cost of silence in the face of systematic abuse. His notebooks, once buried in a mislabeled evidence box, now serve as curriculum materials in ethics courses at law schools across the country, teaching future lawyers about the courage required to speak truth to power. In the end, Michael Thompson did become the lawyer he had dreamed of being. He spent 21 years making his case from beyond the grave, building evidence, gathering witnesses, and waiting for the right moment to present his arguments to a jury of his peers. When the verdict finally came, justice was unanimous, and the silence that had protected his killers was broken forever. 5 years have passed since Michael Thompson's killers were brought to justice, and his story continues to resonate in ways that would have both amazed and humbled the 24-year-old law student who died trying to protect his fellow students. The Michael Thompson Center for Ethics and Justice at the University of Pennsylvania has become one of the most respected research institutions in the country, leading investigations into institutional abuse and developing best practices for student protection. The center has assisted in uncovering similar corruption cases at 12 other universities, leading to reforms that have protected thousands of students who will never know how close they came to exploitation. Margaret Thompson, now 80, serves as the center's honorary chairwoman despite her declining health. She spends her days reading case files and correspondence from students and families around the world who have found hope in Michael's story. The letters, she says, are proof that her son's voice is still being heard, still protecting people who need someone to stand up for them. Dr. Patricia Wells has written a memoir about her experience as a survivor of the Circle and witness to Michael's murder. Silence and Courage, Living with the Truth, became a bestseller and has been adapted into a documentary that won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Wells donates all proceeds from the book to scholarship funds for first-generation college students, the population that the Circle had specifically targeted for exploitation. Robert Kane served his full sentence and was released from federal prison in 2040. Now 73, he works with a non-profit organization that assists families of missing persons, using his knowledge of police procedures to help navigate investigations that might otherwise go nowhere. He speaks publicly about the corruption that destroyed his career and contributed to Michael's death, though he acknowledges that no amount of good work can undo the harm he helped cause. The University of Pennsylvania has been transformed by the scandal. New leadership, new oversight procedures, and a culture of transparency have made it a model for institutional accountability. The Thompson Center's annual conference draws researchers, law enforcement officials, and survivors from around the world, creating a global network dedicated to preventing the kind of systematic abuse that cost Michael his life. Professor Edmund Hartwell died in federal prison in 2029, 4 years into his life sentence. He never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes, maintaining until his death that he had been unfairly prosecuted for activities that were common in academic institutions. His funeral was attended only by a court-appointed attorney and a priest. He was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, his name erased from the academic legacy he had spent his life building. In Philadelphia, Michael Thompson's story has become part of the city's collective memory. A mural depicting him as a guardian angel protecting students covers the side of a building near the university campus. The annual Michael Thompson Memorial Walk for Justice draws thousands of participants who march from the law school to City Hall, carrying signs with the names of other victims of institutional abuse and calling for continued vigilance against corruption. The case has also had an impact on how true crime stories are told. The careful, respectful approach taken by the documentary team that chronicled Michael's story has become a model for ethical crime, reporting that honors victims while demanding justice. The series won multiple Emmy Awards and sparked conversations about the responsibility of media in covering cases involving institutional failure and systematic abuse. Margaret Thompson's health is failing, but her spirit remains unbroken. She has established a foundation that provides legal assistance to families of missing persons, particularly in cases where institutional corruption or police misconduct may have interfered with investigations. The Foundation's motto, taken from one of Michael's notebook entries, reads, "Justice delayed is not justice denied if someone keeps fighting for the truth." In her final interview, conducted on the 5th anniversary of the arrests, Margaret Thompson offered a reflection that serves as both an ending and a beginning for Michael's story. "I used to think that when people die young, their potential dies with them. I spent 21 years mourning not just the son I lost, but the lawyer he would have become, the cases he would have won, the lives he would have touched. But I've come to understand that potential doesn't die. It just finds different ways to manifest itself." Michael never got to practice law in a courtroom, but his case has changed how justice is administered. He never got to protect clients, but his story has protected countless students from predators. He never got to grow old with someone he loved, but his love for justice has grown into something that will outlive all of us. The silence that killed my son has been replaced by a chorus of voices demanding accountability, transparency, and protection for the vulnerable. That chorus grows louder every year, and Michael's voice is part of it. In that sense, he's still practicing law, still fighting for justice, still protecting people who need someone to stand up for them. That's not the life we planned for him, but it's the legacy he chose when he decided to investigate the circle. And I couldn't be prouder of the lawyer my son became. Today, visitors to Laurel Hill Cemetery often stop at Michael Thompson's grave, where fresh flowers appear weekly, and small tokens are left by people whose lives have been touched by his story. The simple headstone reads, "Michael James Thompson, 1979-2003, defender of justice, protector of the innocent, beloved son." But perhaps the most fitting memorial is not carved in stone, but written in the lives that have been saved by the reforms his sacrifice made possible. In law schools across the country, professors begin their ethics courses by reading excerpts from Michael's notebooks, ensuring that future generations of lawyers understand that sometimes the most important cases are the ones that require us to risk everything to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The silence has been broken. The truth lives on, and somewhere in the echo of a young man's courage, justice continues to find its voice. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Michael Thompson's story. See you in the next video.